In the autumn of 1843, the Hartwell Estate stood silent against the rolling English countryside, its tall windows reflecting nothing but gray skies and endless fields. To outsiders, it was a symbol of refinement and wealth. To the villagers nearby, it was something else entirely, a house that watched. Edward Hartwell was a respected man of influence, educated, composed, and impossibly private. When he married his first wife, Eleanor Whitmore, the town celebrated what seemed to be a perfect union. Eleanor was gentle, intelligent, and admired for her calm temperament. No one could have imagined how quickly that calm would unravel. The first changes were subtle. Eleanor began complaining about faint sounds at night, soft footsteps pacing the corridor, outside her bedroom. Edward dismissed them as servants moving about after hours, but the servants insisted they never walked the upper halls once the master retired. Weeks passed. Eleanor's sleep grew restless. She claimed the walls hummed after midnight, as though something within them vibrated softly. One evening at dinner, she froze mid-sentence and stared at the far corner of the room. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Edward heard nothing. By winter, Eleanor avoided mirrors. She insisted her reflection lagged behind her movements by a fraction of a second. Once, she swore the woman in the glass smiled when she did not. Her letters to her sister became frantic. She wrote of cold drafts that moved against the wind, of doors found open though locked, of shadows lingering too long after candles were extinguished. Most disturbing of all, she believed someone was crying beneath the floors. Edward grew impatient with the rumors spreading among the staff. He confined Eleanor to the east wing for her rest. The windows there were narrow, the halls unusually quiet. Visitors were discouraged. Then came the night of the storm. Thunder rolled across the estate, shaking its foundations. Servants later reported hearing Eleanor scream, not in fear but in revelation. "They're inside the walls," she cried. "They never leave." By morning she was unrecognizable. Her hair disheveled, her voice hoarse, her eyes hollow with terror. She repeated the same words endlessly. The house remembers. Within a month, Eleanor Hartwell was declared mentally unwell and transferred to a private asylum in London. Edward informed the town that she suffered from a hereditary condition. Most accepted the explanation. Some did not. By spring of 1845, the east wing was sealed. Repairs, Edward claimed, but at night, servants still avoided walking past its doors, because sometimes, in the stillness after midnight, faint tapping could be heard behind the walls, and it did not sound like madness. It sounded like someone trying to get out. In the spring of 1847, Edward Hartwell remarried. Margaret Hale was practical, observant, and unimpressed by village gossip. She had heard the whispers about the first wife's madness, but she believed in logic, not superstition. Hartwell Estate, to her, was simply an old structure with drafts and overworked servants. For several months, nothing seemed unusual. Margaret reorganized the household, questioned expenses, and insisted on inspecting every part of the estate. Only one area remained forbidden, the sealed east wing. Edward explained it was structurally unsafe. His tone was calm but final. Margaret accepted the answer, at least for a time. The first unsettling moment came late one evening. While standing before a mirror, she noticed her reflection seemed slightly delayed, not dramatically, just enough to disturb her. She lifted her hand. The image followed a fraction too late. She stepped away quickly. The delay vanished. Days later, descending the staircase, she saw a woman standing at the bottom landing, pale dress, dark hair, completely still. Margaret blinked. The hallway was empty. She began documenting everything. Temperature drops in sealed rooms. Doors found unlocked at precisely 2:17 a.m. A faint vibration beneath the west corridor floorboards. After midnight. Then she heard it. A low rhythmic sound beneath the wood. Not footsteps. Breathing. One night she knelt and pressed her ear against the floor. The sound was clearer, uneven, almost like suppressed sobbing. She confronted Edward, but he dismissed it as imagination fueled by isolation. His expression never shifted, yet something in his stillness unsettled her more than the noise itself. Winter came early that year. Margaret changed. She stopped reorganizing rooms, stopped asking questions. Instead, she would sit motionless in the drawing room, staring at the far wall as if listening. When Edward asked what troubled her, she answered quietly, "It's learning me." Her sleep deteriorated. She insisted the corridors stretched longer at night, that doors appeared slightly farther away than before, that the house adjusted itself when she wasn't looking. Then one freezing night, a maid found her standing before the sealed east wing door at 3 a.m. Her palm rested flat against the wood. She was whispering softly. When Edward approached, Margaret turned with eerie calm. "She's still inside," she said. "Who?" he demanded. "The first one." Within weeks, Margaret Hale Hartwell was declared mentally unwell. She was escorted away under medical supervision, her gaze distant but strangely certain. The villagers spoke in hushed tones again. 2 wives, both lost to madness, and always the east wing remained locked. But beneath the silence of Hartwell Estate, something no longer felt accidental. It felt deliberate. In 1851, Edward Hartwell married for the 3rd time. Catherine Moore was younger than the others, educated in literature and history, with a particular fascination for old estates and their secrets. Unlike Margaret, she did not try to control the house. Unlike Eleanor, she did not fear it at first. She studied it. From the moment she arrived, Catherine sensed that Hartwell Estate held patterns, subtle repetitions in sound, movement and silence. The clocks in the West Hall would occasionally stop at 2:17 a.m., only to resume by morning. Candles burned unevenly in certain rooms, always leaning toward the same wall, and the east wing remained sealed. Edward's explanation had not changed. Structural weakness, dangerous flooring, nothing more. Catherine pretended to accept this. But she began exploring the estate's library, a vast and dusty chamber rarely used. Behind ledgers and property deeds, she discovered older documents, journals, belonging to previous generations of Hartwells. One entry dated 1798 caught her attention. The foundation must be maintained. Silence requires devotion. Another, decades later, the house protects us as long as it is fed. Catherine felt a chill reading those words. As weeks passed, she noticed something stranger. The walls in the east corridor were slightly thicker than elsewhere. When she tapped gently against them, the echo sounded hollow, not like empty space but like depth. Late one night, unable to sleep, she walked the corridor alone. The air felt heavier there still. Then she heard it. A faint tapping, 3 slow knocks. She froze. The sound came again from inside the wall. Catherine pressed her hand against the surface. It was warm. The tapping stopped immediately. The following day, she confronted Edward with the journals. For the first time, his composure faltered. Only slightly. A tightening of the jaw. A pause too long. "Old family metaphors," he said carefully. Nothing more. But Catherine had already begun forming her own theory. The Hartwell estate had not driven the wives mad. It had prepared them. Over the next month, her behavior changed. She spent hours mapping the estate's layout from memory, measuring corridors, counting steps between doors. She became convinced the sealed east wing was not simply a damaged section, but a barrier, a containment. Servants reported hearing Catherine speaking softly to herself in the halls. "It needs 5, she murmured once. 5 to remain quiet." On a storm-heavy evening in October, Catherine disappeared for nearly 3 hours. She was later found sitting calmly outside the east wing door, smiling. Edward demanded to know what she had seen. Catherine's reply was steady. "It isn't empty," she said, "and it isn't haunted." She looked directly at him. "It's hungry." Edward did not sleep that night. Neither did Lillian. The estate felt awake. At breakfast, Edward avoided her eyes. His hands trembled as he poured tea. "You went into the east wing," he said. "Yes. You don't understand what you're disturbing." "I understand enough," she replied. "It isn't the house that needs protection. It's whatever you've kept beneath it." That night, the vibration under the floors grew stronger. The servants locked themselves inside their quarters. The wind circled the estate like it was waiting. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the grandfather clock didn't stop. It shattered. The sound echoed through the halls. Lillian was already standing at the east wing. The door was slightly open. This time she didn't hesitate. Stone steps spiraled downward beneath the manor. The air grew colder with each step. Halfway down, she heard it clearly. Breathing. Slow, heavy, patient. Edward stood at the bottom holding a lantern. "You shouldn't have opened it," he said. "You should have told me the truth." He stepped aside. The cellar opened into a wide underground chamber supported by old wooden beams. In the center stood a reinforced iron boundary filled with disturbed soil. The ground inside shifted slowly, as if something turned beneath it. "It demands balance," Edward whispered. "The wives?" Lillian asked. "They weren't taken," he said. "They chose." The soil suddenly rippled. A pale human hand emerged. Not dead, alive. Lillian stepped closer. The hand did not reach for her. It pointed. At Edward. The chamber trembled. Dust fell from the beams. "You don't understand!" Edward shouted. "If it isn't fed, it spreads." The whisper filled the room louder now. Not a breath. A word. "Keeper." Lillian's heart pounded. This wasn't about sacrifice. It was inheritance. Edward's father, and his father before him, each generation guarding whatever lay beneath. But something had changed. The hand remained pointed at Edward. The soil began rising around his feet. He stumbled back, fear breaking through his control. "You opened the door," he said desperately. Lillian shook her head. "No, you kept it closed too long." The earth surged upward. The lantern flickered violently. And then, darkness swallowed the chamber. Darkness swallowed the chamber. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of soil shifting. Then the lantern sparked back to life. Edward was on his knees inside the iron boundary. The earth had risen to his waist, packed tight around him like living cement. His hands clawed at it, but it did not loosen. Lillian stood frozen outside the boundary. "Help me!" Edward shouted. "You don't know what it will do." The whisper returned, stronger now. "Keeper." The pale hand had vanished beneath the soil, but the ground still moved, pulsing gently as if breathing. Lillian stepped closer to the iron bars. They were warm, not from fire, from something alive beneath. "What are you keeping?" she asked. Edward's face broke. "It isn't a monster," he said hoarsely. "It's a wound." The chamber trembled again. "My grandfather found it when he expanded the cellar. A hollow beneath the earth. Something ancient. It was spreading into the roots, poisoning the land. Crops died. Livestock went mad. The soil tightened around him. He winced. So he made a pact," Lillian whispered. Edward nodded weakly. "One life bound to it. One keeper to contain it. The land survives. The house stands. But the keeper never leaves." The whisper grew louder, overlapping itself. "Keeper, keeper." Lillian's pulse thundered in her ears. "And the wives?" she demanded. "They stayed," Edward gasped. "Some by choice. Some because they loved the keeper too much to leave him alone down here." The earth climbed to his chest. The beams above groaned under pressure. Dust rained down like ash. "It's rejecting me," Edward said, panic rising. "It hasn't done this before." Lillian understood. The boundary wasn't angry. It was changing. "You're weakening," she said softly. Edward's eyes widened. "No. Yes." The soil pulsed harder, rising to his shoulders. The whisper shifted. No longer keeper. Now, balance. The iron bars began to glow faintly. The chamber floor cracked beyond the boundary, thin lines racing toward the stairs. If it broke containment, it wouldn't stop at the estate. Lillian gripped the bars. "If I step inside," she asked quietly, "will it release you?" Edward stared at her, horror flooding his face. "No, it will bind you too." The earth tightened around his throat. "I won't let you," he choked. The chamber shook violently. Above them, somewhere in the house, glass shattered. The boundary needed strength, and Edward no longer had it. The whisper softened now, patient, waiting. Lillian closed her eyes for 1 second. Then she reached for the gate latch. Behind her, the stairs began to crack. The latch was colder than the air. Lillian's fingers trembled around it as the chamber groaned again. A crack split the stone floor behind her, racing toward the iron boundary like a living vein. Edward's voice was barely a whisper now. "Don't." The soil pressed against his throat, holding him upright like a cruel embrace. His eyes pleaded with her, not as a master, not as a husband, but as a man who finally understood the cost of inheritance. The whisper circled them. "Balance." Lillian inhaled slowly. "If this is a wound," she said, "then it was never meant to be chained forever." The gate creaked open. The moment her foot crossed the boundary, the ground reacted. Not violently. Differently. The pulsing beneath the soil shifted rhythm, like a heartbeat adjusting to a new presence. Edward gasped as the earth around his chest loosened slightly. It knows you're not afraid, he rasped. I am afraid, she answered. I'm just not obedient. She stepped fully inside. The soil beneath her feet was warm and strangely soft. The iron bars behind her hummed faintly, sealing shut on their own. The whisper changed again, no longer demanding, listening. Lillian knelt and pressed her palm against the moving earth. It was not rage she felt. It was pressure. Containment force too long. You were never fed, she murmured. You were buried. The chamber shook harder. The beams above splintered. Edward cried out as the soil around him suddenly dropped to his waist, releasing him halfway, but at the same time the ground beneath Lillian's knees began to rise. Not to consume, to connect, thin tendrils of earth wrapped gently around her wrists, not restraining, anchoring. Memories flooded her mind. Not images, sensations, roots strangling stone, water diverted unnaturally, a hollow carved where something ancient once rested freely. The estate hadn't discovered the wound. It had created it. The whisper formed words clearly now. Restore. Edward stared at her in disbelief. What is it showing you? That your family didn't bind it to save the land, she said softly. They bound it to own it. The soil surged outward beyond the boundary. The cracks in the floor stopped spreading. Instead, they began sealing. The iron bars glowed brighter, then dimmed. Edward collapsed forward as the earth released him completely. But Lillian did not fall. She stood. The soil held her upright, steady, like roots recognizing their tree. The whisper faded into silence. The chamber grew still. For the first time since she entered the east wing, there was no breathing beneath the ground, only calm. Edward crawled toward the boundary, shaken. Lillian, what did you do? She looked at him, her expression no longer fearful. I didn't become the keeper, she said quietly. I ended it. Above them, the house settled. No more vibrations, no more cracks, only silence. But deep beneath the estate, something had been set free. Dawn broke over Hartwell Estate with a fragile calm. Fog lingered across the fields, curling around the manor. For the first time in decades, the east wing's windows reflected light freely, unshuttered, unafraid. Edward lay on the chamber floor, exhausted. The soil had settled, leaving him free but forever marked by what he had witnessed. Lillian stepped out of the underground boundary. Dust clung to her clothes, but her eyes were steady. The wives, Edward whispered. They are gone? They are at peace, she said. No one is bound here anymore. The house seemed to exhale. Halls that had groaned and whispered fell silent. Even the east wing, once sealed for generations, now felt warm and inviting. Shadows in corners receded, leaving light where darkness once thrived. Edward rose shakily. How did you? I listened, she said softly. To the whispers. To the pattern. I didn't fight it. I understood it. Outside, the first rays of sun touched the garden. The long-abandoned flower beds were illuminated. The wind carried no trace of past horrors, only a gentle promise of renewal. Yet in the cellar, the soil shifted in small waves like a heartbeat. Lillian glanced back. It's awake, she murmured. But it's not angry. The estate would remain, centuries old, holding its secret beneath the foundation. No longer would it demand obedience. No longer would it consume. Edward finally understood his ancestors' burden. The keeper was never a choice. It was a destiny imposed by the house, by the wound in its walls. For the first time, that destiny was broken. Lillian walked beside him through the halls. Candlelight flickered gently, shadows dancing softly. Outside, birds sang. Fog lifted, revealing rolling fields. Life went on, untouched by decades of horrors within. Edward turned to her. You've freed us. No, she said calmly. We freed ourselves. The estate only wanted to be understood. A soft breeze rustled through the garden. A faint whisper echoed among the leaves. Balance. Then silence. The Hartwell Estate stood still, peaceful at last. Generations of fear, madness, and captivity had ended. Beneath its foundations, the soil remembered. The earth had witnessed centuries of suffering, now resting at last. The east wing doors closed gently behind them, not with force but as a final gesture of release. Lillian smiled faintly. The house's story would live on only in memory, whispers, and the courage of those who dared to listen. The estate was no longer a prison. It was history. Dawn broke over Hartwell Estate with a fragile calm. Fog lingered across the fields, curling around the manor. For the first time in decades, The east wing's windows reflected light freely, unshuttered, unafraid. Edward lay on the chamber floor, exhausted. The soil had settled, leaving him free but forever marked by what he had witnessed. Lillian stepped out of the underground boundary. Dust clung to her clothes, but her eyes were steady. "The wives," Edward whispered. "They are gone?" "They are at peace," she said. "No one is bound here anymore." The house seemed to exhale. Halls that had groaned and whispered fell silent. Even the east wing, once sealed for generations, now felt warm and inviting. Shadows in corners receded, leaving light where darkness once thrived. Edward rose shakily. How did you—" "I listened," she said softly. "To the whispers. To the pattern. I didn't fight it. I understood it." Outside, the first rays of sun touched the garden. The long-abandoned flower beds were illuminated. The wind carried no trace of past horrors, only a gentle promise of renewal. Yet in the cellar, the soil shifted in small waves like a heartbeat. Lillian glanced back. "It's awake," she murmured. "But it's not angry." The estate would remain, centuries old, holding its secret beneath the foundation. No longer would it demand obedience. No longer would it consume. Edward finally understood his ancestors' burden. The keeper was never a choice. It was a destiny imposed by the house, by the wound in its walls. For the first time, that destiny was broken. Lillian walked beside him through the halls. Candlelight flickered gently, shadows dancing softly. Outside, birds sang. Fog lifted, revealing rolling fields. Life went on, untouched by decades of horrors within. Edward turned to her. "You've freed us." "No," she said calmly. "We freed ourselves." The estate only wanted to be understood. A soft breeze rustled through the garden. A faint whisper echoed among the leaves. "Balance." Then silence. The Hartwell Estate stood still, peaceful at last. Generations of fear, madness, and captivity had ended. Beneath its foundations, the soil remembered. The earth had witnessed centuries of suffering, now resting at last. The east wing doors closed gently behind them, not with force but as a final gesture of release. Lillian smiled faintly. The house's story would live on only in memory, whispers, and the courage of those who dared to listen. The estate was no longer a prison. It was history.